Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. Last month's storms left thousands without power for almost a week, and electric companies and co-ops struggling to reestablish the grid.
After this derecho, we had approximately 18,500 members out. And so that was our worst outage ever.
That has left customers looking for answers. Native plants are good for birds and insects and are more resilient to a changing climate.
They require little, if any, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, and of course they aren't going to require mowing.
Some homeowner associations and cities are beginning to encourage planting native species. And a longtime Bloomington restaurant is changing ownership. We'll have these stories plus the latest news from across the state right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. In remote parts of the state, electric co-ops are the only way residents can get power to their homes. They face a unique set of challenges that set them apart from larger investor-owned utilities such as Duke and AES. Clayton Baumgarth met with one customer without power for nearly a week after the derecho and spoke with the provider's CEO to learn more.
Tanya Schreier and her family live in the middle of the Owen Putnam State Forest in a modest 1,400 square foot home. They're surrounded by trees. Getting and maintaining power to their home is an expensive challenge.
$600.
A month?
At least, yeah.
You're kidding me.
It's high.
That's insane.
Yeah.
$600 a month?
It's in the wintertime, it's like $750, $800.
The Schreiers belong to the South Central Indiana Rural Electric Membership Cooperative, or SCI REMC utility provider. The utility covers 1,000 square miles and 7 counties. When the derecho hit the area a few weeks ago, the Schreiers lost power almost immediately.
We load up the gas cans and head into town to get some gasoline for them. On the way in there, we took the chainsaw with us because we are experienced out here, and we had to cut 5 trees out of the road just to get into town.
They went without power for nearly a full week. Luckily, they had generators to keep their kitchen fridge and some fans running, but it wasn't enough to power the whole house. Each generator would run for 7.5 hours and cost $60 a day in fuel. One thing the generators couldn't power was the meat freezers holding hundreds of pounds of deer and hog meat.
We bought a whole pig, so that was I know that was $700 right there. We do have some inside, but not much. We had 3 deer from last year in there, and we stock up, any kind of meat sales. We always stock. I'm going to say, if I had to guess, probably $4,000 in meat.
Electric co-ops such as SCI REMC were created to provide power to hard-to-reach and low-population places like the Owen Putnam State Forest. James Tannenberger is the CEO of the utility. He says the storms took just over half of the co-op's meters offline.
After this derecho, we had approximately 18,500 members out. And so that was our worst outage ever. And our second worst outage was the one that happened at the end of March, where we had 14,500 members out.
In a typical outage, it would be a challenge to get a home like the Schreiers back online due to the sheer amount of vegetation surrounding their power lines. But in an event such as the recent one, it was downright impossible to mobilize enough linemen to fix all of the outages quickly. One reason is that Indiana infrastructure is largely above ground, and another is that every other energy provider was going through the same issue concurrently, causing a shortage of linemen to go around.
Unfortunately, this time, AES and Duke and everyone was getting every contractor that they could. They were not only using their regular contractors, they were having to compete with us for the other contractors across the country.
65% of SCI's service territory is covered in forests, making it unique even among other co-ops in the state. So when it comes to putting lines underground to prevent falling limbs from causing damages like this, the cost to do so is prohibitively expensive.
We estimate that it would take about $400 million to put our existing overhead facilities underground. So with 3,700 miles of facilities, that is a daunting task whenever you're also trying to keep rates stable.
Tannenberger tells me that his utility is a top 2 spender for Indiana co-ops on vegetation management, and even with nearly $5 million a year going towards trimming trees, it often isn't enough.
We can't account for the perfectly healthy live trees that during a major wind event fall from outside our right-of-way onto our lines. Our easements are about 50 feet wide. We trim to the edge of our easement, and as you know, a 60, 70, 100-foot tall tree can easily reach our line.
So what can customers like the Schreiers do? According to Kerwin Olson of the Citizens Action Coalition, engaging with electric co-ops is often a challenge for his group.
None of those entities are regulated by the state, so there's no, single body, if you will, that you can go to participate in the processes.
In 2012, co-ops began pulling out of the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, thanks to legislation allowing co-ops to set their own rates and to obtain financing. In other words, investor-owned utilities such as Duke and AES are subject to transparent documentation through the commission, while co-ops aren't, causing consumers trouble when there are complaints to be made.
When an RMC customer filed a complaint at the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General office referred them to the IURC. And then the IURC then says, well, we have no jurisdiction.
Tanya and her family were fortunate to have generators to keep portions of their home on during the outage. Other households weren't so lucky and have life-saving appliances like CPAP machines to worry about as well.
If something more serious happened, we'd be without for a long time because, not only is it SCRAC trying to get out here, but the roads sometimes are impassable. So we kind of got all kinds of strikes against us. I guess that's the perks of living in the country.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Clayton Baumgarth.
Citizens Action Coalition and the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor have filed a petition to investigate AES Indiana's practices for restoring power after storm outages. They said that as energy companies continue to increase rates, it's important they reliably provide energy. Indiana students missed out on weeks or months of in-person instruction during the pandemic, and state test results released Wednesday shows the disruption is still taking a toll. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Dylan Piers-McCoy reports that some students are faring better than others.
Just 3 out of 10 Indiana elementary and middle school students met the state goals for math and English proficiency on the spring iLearn exams. That's substantially below scores before the pandemic. Charity Flores is the chief academic officer with the Indiana Department of Education. She says the overall pace of learning has stabilized. Many students, however, are still struggling.
As systems have returned to those normal rates of learning, how do we ensure that the students have also returned at least to the normal rates of learning?
State officials are particularly concerned about English language learners. About 8% passed the exams this year.
We're joined now by WFYI education reporter Dylan Piers-McCoy for more on the iLearn results. Welcome to the show, Dylan.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So we know many Indiana students are not passing the state test. Do we have other evidence that students are still struggling?
Yeah, these results mirror what we've seen in some national data and analysis. It really shows that students are still behind where they would have been without the pandemic. A few days ago, a company called NWEA, which does student testing throughout the year around the country, they released an analysis that found that students are learning at similar rates as they were before the pandemic, or even they're still learning more slowly than before the pandemic. That's a problem because we need students to catch up, essentially, right? They missed out on all this instruction. So we actually need students to be learning at faster rates. And we've seen some evidence of that, but we've also seen a lot of evidence of students learning at slower rates or just not being able to make that catch-up growth. We've also have some results from state reading exams. They show the number of students with foundational reading skills are at their lowest point in at least a decade. So iLearn is not the only data point we have right now that shows that students are still struggling.
So you mentioned English language learners struggled the most. Are there groups that are seeing improvement or at least getting back to pre-pandemic results?
There are some bright spots. What the Department of Education said essentially was that the students who fared the best on this exam were those who were considered proficient before the pandemic. So students who weren't proficient before the pandemic are having a harder time catching up. We also saw the number of Black students passing iLearn went up on both math and English, which was good because we'd seen some real declines. And the pace of learning has stabilized across all grades. What that means is that overall students are learning about as much as they were before the pandemic. But like I said, we want to see some acceleration in order to try and catch up from what students missed out on. iLearn passing rates are behind where they were before the pandemic for pretty much every student group. So that includes students who are getting free and reduced price lunch, as well as students who are paying full price for lunch, students who are receiving special education services, as well as students who are in general education. We're still seeing lower passing rates for all those groups.
And just really briefly, Dylan, we have like under 30 seconds. What's the state trying to do to help students make up lost ground?
Schools have gotten this huge surge of federal money. They've also gotten a surge of money from the state. And then I think the other thing that we're looking to help students make up ground is a big focus on literacy. The state is, along with Lilly Endowment, is investing $111 million in reading instruction, and we're really doubling down on the science of reading, which includes a focus on things like phonics instruction.
Dylan, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, we're joined now by Clayton Baumgarth for more headlines from around the area.
Thank you, Joe. Former Indiana Attorney General Curtis Hill is running for governor. He's joining a crowded Republican primary that includes U.S. Senator Mike Braun, Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, and Fort Wayne businessman Eric Doden. Hill comes into the race with significant baggage. He criminally battered 4 women while in office, and he's already at a significant financial disadvantage to the other candidates. But political scientist Andrew Downs says some voters' views on issues like sexual misconduct have changed, pointing to the fact that Donald Trump is the GOP favorite for president despite a recent sexual assault verdict in civil court.
People now sort of saying, yeah, it's okay if you did that, if you have the right position on the issues, I'm with you.
On the fundraising front, Downs says Hill has a lot of catching up to do when 3 opponents already have millions of dollars in their campaign accounts. State Representative Earl Harris Jr. says he and Indiana's Black Legislative Caucus are pushing to get more minority students in colleges after the Supreme Court recently struck down affirmative action in college admissions. Federally funded schools such as IU, Notre Dame, and Purdue can no longer use race-conscious admissions. Harris says he fears this change will have a generational impact on African American and minority students.
While this is a big step backwards, it does not mean it has to be the final step.
He hopes this decision will get more people engaged in the cause and increase support for those seeking higher education. One of Indiana's primary abortion care providers says they have no more open appointments 3 weeks ahead of the state's near total abortion ban taking effect. In a statement Wednesday, Planned Parenthood says it's at full capacity for abortion care through the end of July, though its clinics are still able to provide other reproductive services. In a recent ruling, the Indiana Supreme Court allowed the state's ban to take effect August 1st, and even for legal abortions in the state, the law won't allow Planned Parenthood to perform them. It bans abortion clinics outright. The Bloomington Tavern Lenny's is changing hands after 34 years. Founders Lenny Bush and Jeff Meese sold the establishment to longtime employee Michael Fox and Samantha Izzo earlier this month. Ethan Sandweids has this report.
Bush, the namesake of Lenny's, says managing their other businesses has made it hard to give the tavern the attention she thinks it deserves. She's glad to hand it off to close friends and coworkers.
We weren't really particularly looking, but somehow the conversation started and it was like, wow, I couldn't have planned this any better.
Fox and Izzo met at Lenny's when they began working there in 2002. Fox continued working at Lenny's, leaving in 2017 as general manager. Izzo helped Mies and Bush start One World Catering from the Lenny's Kitchen in 2008. Bush hopes that the couple will bring new ideas to the restaurant while preserving its character.
They love this industry. There is new and different stuff happening all the time. So I'm not saying we're going to throw the baby out with the bacon turkey melt, but, they are going to want to, do some things on their own.
For Indiana News Desk, I'm Ethan Sandweiss.
Monroe County Parks and Recreation want the county council to allocate money for synthetic turf on fields 9 and 11 at Carts Athletic Complex's fields. The proposal got strong support from Lewis Malone, the executive director of the Cutters Soccer Club. He sees the complex as a potential site for more sports tournaments.
You need to have guaranteed fields that are going to be able to be played on. That's pretty routine. And most top teams or top tournaments want to have turf fields for those championship games.
And Joe, the cost of the project is estimated to be more than $4 million.
All right, thanks, Clayton. Coming up next on Indiana News Desk. Construction will begin next year on the Monon South Trail, which will link New Albany to Mitchell. And some cities and HOAs are beginning to encourage the planting of native species, despite complaints they look like weeds. These stories and more right here on Indiana News Desk.
I have always believed that people are at the heart of every story we tell.
Any story or interview that makes people who watch it say, I hadn't thought of it in that way. That, for me, is gold.
I like to be able to leave the viewer with some sort of emotion, whether it's outrage, whether it's someone overcoming long odds, telling a big story through an individual story.
What makes the NewsHour different is that we have time to be thoughtful about the stories that we tell, the voices that we intend to elevate.
I know the role that good journalism plays in making all of us feel more connected to each other, in helping all of us understand each other a little bit better. I see this as a mission, and I see this as a service.
Welcome back to Indiana News Desk. Construction will begin for the Monon South Trail next year. The rail trail will span 62.3 miles starting in New Albany and ending in Mitchell. Isabella Vesperini has this report.
Construction of the trail is expected to cost more than $40 million. Radius, the economic development nonprofit behind the trail, plans to cut costs by making most of the trail out of crushed limestone and building a 10-foot wide trail in more rural areas.
The railroad was actually dormant for the last, 10 years or so. And at one time there were stored railroad cars there that weren't being used anymore. And then the trees started growing up, so it was an area that needed some revitalization.
The trail will promote accessibility and safety. Toolkits will be available at multiple trailheads for people to fix their bikes. Water fountains, restrooms, and benches will be included.
Trails like this are seen first as a good asset, a good quality of place asset for the people who live in a community now, and as kind of a lodestone, a magnet that can bring in new people.
While some are concerned about crime and littering on the trail, overall feedback has been overwhelmingly positive.
This region of southern Indiana really is kind of a desert when it comes to trails, so we're meeting a largely unmet need by providing this trail. And they feel proud of their communities. They're glad to know their community is going to be on the longest Rails to Trails project in the state of Indiana.
Quile said Radius has been working with the community to plan where to put trailheads and historical markers. He hopes volunteer groups will help repair any damage to the trail. For Indiana News Desk, I'm Isabella Vesperini.
Construction on the Monon South Trail is expected to take several years. Native plants aren't just good for birds and bees, they also make the land more resilient to the effects of climate change and can even help prevent it. But cities and homeowners associations don't always like the way they look, putting them at odds with residents who want to grow native plants in their yards. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Rebecca Thiel reports.
Aja Yasir's yard in Gary is full of flowers, food, and medicines. Many of these plants are indigenous.
I was excited today. Some people might not be excited to see this, but I was excited to see some fleabane growing, which is an indigenous plant. It's also medicinal. I feel like every time I see more and more plants just show up, I feel like, okay, I'm doing something right.
Yasir and her family bought this once vacant lot in 2016, just a few months after her daughter passed away. Before they even moved in, Yasir would travel to and from Illinois every day, building up the sandy soil with leaves, cardboard, compost, and wood chips.
It's been like an asylum for me. It's been an emotional release. It's also been a way to feed my family. It's been a lot for us as a family.
But not everybody liked the look of Yasir's yard. She got a citation from the city in 2017 and another the following year. After a year-long court battle, the last one was finally dropped. Even today, it's a struggle for Yasir to keep her plants. This summer, her utility chopped up her apricot and nectarine trees. She says she probably won't get fruit from them this year.
It's been exhausting. The whole thing has been absolutely exhausting.
Yasir isn't alone. Some homeowners that have converted their lawns to native plants have gotten slapped with fines or even had their yards mowed without permission. The reason? Taller native plants can get mistaken for weeds. Many cities don't allow weeds to grow above a certain height, and they don't take the time to find out what's what. But native plants can have a lot of benefits for the planet. They keep the land cooler. Native plants tend to be taller, so they provide more shade. They also use heat from their environment to pull water up from the soil and out their leaves in something called evapotranspiration.
So it's a process that actually removes energy from the system, thus cooling the air. It's the exact same principle as sweating.
Native plants also do more to prevent flooding. Reynolds says mowed grass is all one length, so it doesn't trap water as well as native plants can during a heavy rain. Native plants also have longer roots, which keeps the soil in place and helps absorb more of that water. Those taller plants with taller roots can also trap more carbon dioxide, too. Then there's all of those high-maintenance things you need for a lawn that you don't need for native plants.
They require little, if any, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, and of course they aren't going to require mowing. All of these inputs generate greenhouse gas emissions.
That means maintaining native plants likely doesn't contribute to climate change. Because of these benefits and others, some cities have started to work with homeowners to encourage native plants.
This one is an example of a yard that's actually in compliance, yet we get a lot of complaints about it.
If a Bloomington resident gets a complaint about weeds, but they say they're native plants, it's Linda Thompson's job to go find out. She says she can identify a lot of plants already, but when she's stumped, she uses an app.
Looks like it is a Chinese clematis, so I'll have to go back to the office and look that up. I doubt that that's, it's not native, but I'm pretty sure that's not on the invasive list.
Bloomington changed its ordinance to define a weed as an invasive plant, a plant that can spread out of control and prevent other plants from growing. Thompson says homeowners in Bloomington can plant almost anything they want in their yards, as long as it's not invasive and doesn't block traffic sight lines or sidewalks.
I searched all over the place for a definition for weed, and there isn't one except a plant that's growing somewhere where you don't want it to grow. It's all a matter of aesthetics, and the city does not enforce, aesthetics.
But even if your local government allows it, your homeowners association might not. Zach Sprunger plants a milkweed in his native garden in Carmel. About 6 years ago, he got a letter from his HOA saying his plants were too tall.
Instead of freaking out and being confrontational, I just called some HOA board members and had a conversation to explain why I was doing what I was doing. And to my surprise, everyone was very open, very understanding.
They came to an agreement. Now Sprunger has what he calls a mullet, with shorter native plants in the front yard and taller ones in the back.
The idea is any of our neighbors walking along the sidewalk would just see a normal house.
Sprunger also joined the HOA board and works to put native plants in common areas around the neighborhood. Still, only a handful of HOAs and local governments in the state are encouraging native plants. In order to see more, Ajay Yasir says Hoosiers will have to change their ideas of what a residential yard can be.
If I were thinking of a utopian world, everybody would be growing their own food, people would be trading food, And it would just be beautiful. You wouldn't have abandoned places because you would find use for abandoned places, you know? So, but it starts with the people.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
And Taylor Swift asks her fans to meet her at midnight, but Indiana University is asking scholars to meet them in November for an academic conference on the popular singer-songwriter. IU's Arts and Humanities Council will host scholars and special guests to discuss Swift's industry impact, artistry, business strategies, and more for an event dubbed Taylor Swift: The Conference Era.
I'm excited to just talk about everything related to Taylor Swift, good, bad, and everything in between.
Almanza said she expects about 100 people to attend the conference, and she's hoping to involve local businesses with Taylor Swift-themed events or specials throughout the weekend. That's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.